Hi everyone, I'm Dan Pertu. For my next guest on my Muse in Music blog, I am thrilled to be interviewing conductor Thomas Fortner. Thomas is currently the assistant conductor and youth orchestra music director of the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra, a position he has held since 2017. Fortner has appeared as guest conductor with the Southwest Minnesota Orchestra and the Twin City Symphony, a startup orchestra exploring innovative programming and venues. Previously, Fortner was assistant conductor of the Baltimore Symphony Youth Orchestra. As the founder and artistic director of the Iowa Great Lakes Music Festival, he partnered with local performing arts presenters to bring world class chamber music performances to the Iowa Great Lakes region. In 2016, Fortner served as the assistant conductor for the Martha Graham Dance Company at the Library of Congress during their revival of the original ballet to Copland's Appalachian Spring. In this interview, we talk about Thomas's recommended listening list during quarantine. I hope you enjoy it. Really happy to be talking now with Thomas Fortner of the South Dakota Symphony. And what I've been doing on my blog recently has been to be asking people to share their recommended listening list for quarantine. Because, you know, as we all know, this is just a weird time and we can't experience music the way we normally experience it. But I find that people actually, you know, since they have some extra time in their hands or at least at home, are really enjoying these recommended listening lists. And it's a chance for conductors and musicians to share some recordings and some thoughts about things that people may not necessarily come into contact with on their own. So Thomas, I'd just love to hear your picks for, tell us a little about where you come from with these picks for listening. And, I'm very glad to have you here.
It's good to be here, Dan. So it's hard to choose. There's so much music to pick. Right before this interview today, I was thinking, trying to think of what stuff I've been listening to. Recently, I've been because I'm working on a program right now for movie music later on this year with South Dakota Symphony, since we've had to reprogram this same concert like 5 different times.
Yeah.
So we're trying to find movie music that has smaller numbers. So classic is the Psycho Suite.
Okay.
Psycho, from Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock. And in that same vein, the soundtrack to There Will Be Blood, Daniel Day-Lewis, written by Jonny Greenwood. Is really fantastic. Jonny Greenwood, of course, is the guitar player from Radiohead, which is one of my favorite bands. Jonny Greenwood actually has a lot of interesting music for strings. He seems to only write for strings typically. That is out there. There's actually some great concerts on YouTube of him playing, a whole program of him doing Electric Counterpoint by Steve Reich, as well as working with some chamber orchestras in London on some of his other, I think some other movie music for Paul Thomas Anderson and other stuff. But it's very like Ligeti-esque. But it's really well done. There's another piece of music that I discovered on the radio over the summer by William Grant Still, which I don't know his work very well. And of course, now we're getting to know a lot of music of underrepresented composers. And I think I had played a piece of his before, at least one, when I was at Peabody. But this string quartet, I think it's called the Lyric Quartet.
Okay.
Is really beautiful. It sounds like almost like an impressionistic piece, which you wouldn't expect from somebody living in America.
Right.
So those are a few things.
So with the first one, tell me a little more about. You said the soundtrack was Ligeti-esque, which that made me really interested, and then I'll get to the William Grant Still in a second. But with the first one, so there might be people who don't know much about Ligeti, and there might be um, and to put that on top of that, to put that into a soundtrack, that's kind of interesting because with soundtracks, you kind of expect more to be, there's sort of a stereotype, right, of movie music.
Yeah.
Um, Even though movie music, of course, runs a wide gamut. But maybe can you talk a little bit about sort of what listeners could expect from that? What's sort of the sensibility, the mood, and that kind of stuff.
Well, certain movies, the soundtrack plays a really big part, and other movies it doesn't. So the classic example of movies that you see today, typically like that have orchestral scores, we'll just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, not pop music scores, are things like the superhero Marvel movie stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they all have the same soundtrack,
Right.
and it's the same chord progression, same instrumentation. But other movies throughout time, including now and in the past, the soundtrack is really a critical role. I think, for example, Star Wars would not be what it is without the soundtrack of John Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would. His soundtrack lends such a class and a scope and an emotional ethos to each scene in those movies, and I think otherwise it would be kind of hokey. I mean, movies in some ways kind of are hokey, although I'm a huge fan. But without his score classing up the joint, it wouldn't be there. Another really great example of, I guess you would call it movie soundtrack music, even though the music was not written for the movie, was 2001: Space Odyssey.
Of course, yeah.
Where the music plays a huge role in a lot of those scenes, and that's where most people know the music of Ligeti from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, atmospheres.
Yeah, atmospheres, and this really, I think there's something also from his Requiem, some vocal music, when they're on the moon and the aliens are there. I don't know, and it's really creepy music. It's a lot of clusters and a lot of notes stacked on top of each other, and building these giant masses of sound.
Yeah.
So it's not like a John Williams score where there's melody and accompaniment and more of a standard classical. Although John Williams certainly does a fair deal of atmospheric music as well. So Ligeti played, I think, a major role in adding to the anxiety level of that movie.
Yeah.
The tension. So the Johnny Greenwood piece, from There Will Be Blood, is also very much inspired by Penderecki.
Yeah.
And I think the very opening of that movie is fantastic. There's no dialogue for 20 minutes,
mm-hmm.
which is pretty amazing. So you have this, if you don't know the movie already, you have the main character who's out in the middle of nowhere, out in West, mining for silver or whatever. And you start off with the string orchestra. Everybody's playing like their own note, and I think there are a lot of quarter tones even. And then all of a sudden they start to glissando together and merge on one note, and they hold that note really intensely for a second and then merge back out. And just that effect is really jarring, and it happens around the time when the main character falls down the well, breaks his leg. He's all alone. And he has to drag himself through the rocks and through the desert back to civilization so that he can get treatment. And the movie itself is very intense and very, obviously, There Will Be Blood.
So, the title like that.
Yeah. And I've always enjoyed that aspect of some of the Radiohead songs. They have really great string arrangements that are not just whole notes. Well, they're whole notes, but they're not whole notes like you typically find in pop music. There's a lot of, harmonically, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
So let's see. So yeah, Penderecki and Ligeti-esque. I think that type of music is really interesting. That era or that technique of writing music,
Yeah.
sonic masses is really interesting.
Well, and that is, yeah, I mean, you're bringing up the sonic masses, the sound masses, and it is a very different, it's a different way of listening. But I think it would be, it's a really interesting pick because um, frequently when I interview people for this blog, a lot of the picks can be more from the traditional canon or whatever.
Right.
And that, nothing wrong with that. And I love that, and I've heard some great recordings now of the Dvorak Cello Concerto or Mozart 41, which again, some of my favorite music. But then to have something like this, the whole sound mass effect, it's a different kind. So it's a different kind of listening. You sort of sit back, you let the sound sort of wash over you, um, and it's not traditionally a progression so much. It's more of it's an experience, right? So it's not a same kind of goal orientedness that you might expect from sort of more traditional music.
Yeah, I think it's there are different ways to listen to music, I think. And I don't mean necessarily actively. I just mean
Right.
in the situation that you find yourself in. So when you're in a, I think this type of music is really phenomenal in a movie situation because
Mm-hmm.
it can add so much tension, and it can also create a sense of space.
Mm-hmm.
So in both of these cases, 2001: Space Odyssey and There Will Be Blood. There Will Be Blood is set out in the open, the West, where it's just nothing but tumbleweeds and cactus and rocks, and you get that fantastic feeling of there's nothing really human about that music in the sense of like there's not a melody and there's not the standard comfortable things we feel. Instead, it's just sound. It's just these, you know, um, clusters of notes. And the same thing with um, with the with space music.
Mm-hmm.
It's this endless space.
Well, as you talk about this too, and then I want to go on to the William Grant Still.
Yeah.
Um, I can't help but think of that obelisk that was planted in Utah. I mean, and they had to, either someone had a good sense of humor, or it's 2020, or the aliens came and then they decided we were too ill to deal with us, so they left a gift for us. I don't know. But I keep getting that feeling of now Utah isn't cacti and that kind of stuff, but still, it makes me think of
It's kind
that.
of a random place. I mean, some people in a helicopter found it. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't people hiking. They really had to go out there.
Right, yeah. So, okay, well, going back to the to William Grant Still's lyric quartet. So you're saying an impressionist piece. Now, honestly, I am not familiar with this piece.
Yeah.
A lot of people I know love impressionism. Of course, you think of Debussy and Ravel, and you think of sort of watery, liquidy kinds of sounds, a lot of textures and that kind of stuff. So this and that's interesting. When I think of William Grant Still, I think more of maybe of a more not French sound, right? So
Yeah.
impressionism I
Vocal
associate with the
music.
French.
I
Yeah,
think he's known for his vocal music. He's a composer I don't know very well. I mean, I've heard his name so much, but people never program him.
yeah,
And finally, rightfully, we're like, well, maybe we should, you know, look at these folks, especially with American music. We're always like, well, we got to solve the whole American music problem, and that's been going on since we invaded this country in the 1700s. But um, yeah, it's his piece. So I guess what's interesting is what makes a piece of music impressionist.
right.
I host a weekly discussion group with my youth orchestra students every week. It's our creativity club. We call it State of Our Art. It's also the name of my podcast. And with these kids, a lot of them are young composers. A few people aren't composers; they're just really interested in understanding what makes music work, um, reverse engineering music, and that is my job as a conductor in a lot of ways, is to take a piece of music, a score, and try to figure out, okay, what's going on here, what's this going to sound like, and what's the optimum way to make this sound the way it is, and what is really going on, because you can listen to music at a surface level, but when you need to recreate it, when you need to perform it, you have to understand, I think, in a very deep way, the connective tissue that
Hmm.
binds the piece together and that shapes the piece, so that you can really structure the energy and the dynamics and the articulation and all the things that you need to deal with when you're a performer. You need to structure it in a way that is expressive and that carries out the architectural vision and the vision of the composer. So with William Grant Still, I was just re-listened to the piece a few minutes ago, and I didn't listen close enough, but I'm still asking myself what makes it sound impressionistic, and I think you got to go with the classic, from a harmonic standpoint. You don't have the typical goal oriented, as you say, music that is creates tension and then tries to resolve it.
Right.
Instead, you create a lighter tension, not tension like Ligeti and Johnny
Right.
Greenwood and Penderecki, but a mild tension, and then you just let it sit there.
Hmm.
And a lot of that is I don't know if it was chicken or the egg here in this case, but with jazz music, you find a lot of that stuff. I know that a lot of the jazz greats were big listeners to Debussy and Ravel,
Hmm.
but I find it really fascinating that that style of music made its way over here.
Yeah. And and I also think it's interesting you mentioned, so I it makes a lot of sense now, music that sort of creates a mild tension, you let it sit.
Yeah,
But then you mentioned the issue of the American music problem, which I think is a really interesting question, because um, when William Grant Still was writing, earlier part of the 20th century, um, we did really have an American music problem, right? I mean, what was the identity of American music? Well, there's Copland, who was starting to, or was, especially in the 30s and 40s, sort of starting to define aspects of American music, right, with his
right.
wide open spaces. And we've talked about that sort of a theme in our discussion already. But
Yeah.
yeah, could you talk maybe a little more about this American music problem and also how William Grant Still fits into
Because
it, maybe?
Copeland went and studied with Noni Boulanger. So
Right.
many of the great American composers went to France. Uh, Philip Glass, Elliott Carter. I think they went over there for good reason, but because she had this really wonderful way of teaching technique
Yes.
without teaching a specific voice. It was all about counterpoint
Yep.
and the exercise of counterpoint, and the fact that you have people as different as Philip Glass and Elliott Carter
Right.
tells you a lot. But nonetheless, it's still very much a Eurocentric art form. This I have to give credit to Joseph Horowitz, the writer, former New York Times music critic, and author of many books, including Classical Music in America, which I'm looking at on my shelf here. He was actually my first guest that I had on my podcast. So Joe is a critic and a historian, and talked a lot about the interesting beginning of the history of classical music in America, because we're largely, well, predominantly we're a country of immigrants, right? Except
Hmm.
for the native people, which, by the way, we work with here in South Dakota, and their music is very interesting. Um, so I think in a lot of ways, classical music was a way of celebrating one's identity, cultural identity of the old country.
Hmm.
You see that a lot even out here in the Midwest. There's still quite a tradition of choral music, of like the Norwegian, the
Hmm.
German Lutheran traditions. and orchestras started popping up all over the country. But you had, I think, the very first orchestra might have been the Boston Symphony. It's one of the very first, and it was all about, to them, it was all about the great tradition
Yes.
right away. Versus the New York Philharmonic, who, for example, premiered Dvorak's Eighth Symphony, right? So it was about the music of now, and so this issue with American music, it goes hand in hand with trying to find the American identity itself,
Mm-hmm.
which in of itself is problematic because we are a country of immigrants. Like, what is American food, right? Like hot dogs, maybe they're Germanic, hamburger. I mean, it's just, yeah. So it's trying to find the American voice. Dvorak had a really interesting stab at it. Dvorak was brought over to New York to be the dean of what eventually became Juilliard, but it was like the American Conservatory, I believe it was what it was called. And he worked with young composers, and so he naturally had an interest in trying to help his students find their own voice. And his prophecy was, there's a lot of really great source material in the music of Native Americans and of African American spirituals and folk music, and so thus you have the Ninth Symphony. But people kind of didn't really go that direction in a lot of ways. The big names that we know now, we're kind of rediscovering composers of color that may have had a little bit more reaction to that. But where the American music that we have is jazz. That was distinctly, and blues and rock. That all came from here. We didn't go to the classical route. That classical thing seemed to be a very European concert hall thing, and it goes hand in hand with the culture. It's really complicated, but it's very interesting as a conductor now of American orchestras, to try to understand where we are and where can we go, and really understand the present moment in terms of the relevance of the symphony orchestra. What's the point in having one? In a time when you can find any recording you want of any piece on YouTube for free.
But I think the quarantine, I have to jump on this point. There were so many points I'd want to talk about, but I have to jump on this. I think the quarantine has at least taught me, I know I can't speak for everyone, but I know I can speak for a lot of people. The quarantine has taught me that YouTube isn't enough, and that Zoom isn't enough, and that the experience of seeing and going to live concerts, you can't replicate it. But going back to what you were saying, I mean, the whole issue of what is American music, yes, it's very interesting. And I just wanted to add to that, and then the whole evolution of American art music after the first part of the 20th century. You sort of have, maybe you could think of it in terms of the New York scene, the uptown composers, the midtown composers, and the downtown composers, right? And the uptown academics, with Columbia University, the midtown people like Bernstein, and I know you know this, but I'm sharing with the viewers. And then the downtown people who, with Greenwich Village and sort of minimalism going out of that and stuff. And so what I think we end up with is a really interesting pluralism, which is sustained even now.
So I want to touch a few points, and that reminds me of, I want to talk about Morton Feldman, one of my favorite composers. But at this point of live music, I felt it for sure when we had our first rehearsal in person again. You can't replicate that sound. There's no technology available yet right now that can replicate that feeling. But I also think, especially music like the Ligeti and so much of new music, you don't do it justice listening to a recording. And I don't know exactly why, but there's something about the experience of sitting in a room and being there and in a way having to focus on it and being surrounded by the sound. Maybe it's a little bit like going to a theater and seeing a movie, but I think it's even more so. Um, in some ways, you have to endure through the experience, but so it's not purely entertainment. It's, you know, some of the stuff can be very dissonant, but that tension, it's almost like a therapy session when you get to the other end of it, is really amazing. And I think that's some of the best way to listen to a lot of new music, is to be in the room with it.
Well, it's also, I mean, very much the issue of being connected with the live performance, or live human beings performing it in the same space too, because we know from neuroscience now about things like mirror neurons and empathy, and it's harder, frankly, to empathize. I mean, Zoom is sort of okay if you're doing it, you know, like an interview or something, but it's much harder to empathize if you aren't physically present.
Yeah, I think there must be something in our brain that understands that you're just a two-dimensional object on my desk, and I can just and you're not in the room, you're not gonna to eat me or try to date with me or offer me food, like,
yeah,
versus somebody who's really in the room. That's like, the lizard part of the brain is already up and ready to go.
Well, thank God for the lizard part. Otherwise, we'd all be out of business. So, well, why don't we go on to your next pick? Do you have?
Well, gee, I kind of got out of order there, but there's so many things to listen to. I think a really interesting piece of music by one of my favorite composers is the Second String Quartet of Morton Feldman.
Okay.
Which, for those people who know, is about a 6-hour piece, continuous. It's depending on how long it runs. I think there's only one quartet that plays it right now. It's called the Flux Quartet, and they play it live. It's not a piece of music that you necessarily have to listen to the whole time, but so much of Feldman's late music is really long and deals with this duration issue, and it messes with your sense of time. And I think that music actually, I actually have heard one of his pieces live, but even through recording it, it's very poignant. I tried being a composer when I was younger, and then I heard Morton Feldman's music, and I was like, somebody already wrote it. I don't need to try.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to write. It's just, I've always been fascinated with harmony, and purely the way that tones can be put together, and not harmony in the sense of like a common practice period, what we typically know of chord progressions, but just putting two notes together or more. And Feldman was a real master of that, along with texture and things. But there are themes that you hear in this quartet that just sort of show up, and they go away, and like an hour later they come back. Alex Ross has, I believe it was Alex Ross, maybe it was Tomasini, I don't, one of those New Yorker guys, or New York Times, had a really great article about listening to it live when the Flux Quartet played. So Morton Feldman's a big pick for me. Any of his late music, the piece that really made me fall in love with his music was Piano and String Quartet.
Okay.
Which is a really simple concept in a way, where you have primarily throughout that whole piece, which is only about an hour and a half long, so it's not that bad. You have these chords that are arpeggiated in the piano and somewhat reflected at the same time, sustained in the strings. And it's all very soft, quiet music. But you can hear it slowly changing. I really noticed the music when I was taking a nap and I had some music playing. That's one of my favorite ways to listen to music in a way. It's like taking a drug, because you turn up the brain and you really just immerse yourself in this. And this piece of music woke me up. And not because it was jarring, but just because it was so beautiful and so interesting and so evocative.
So you say, 6 hours though, right? Did I hear you correctly?
Second String Quartet, yeah.
So what advice do you have for people to sort of cope with that length? Now, I guess you could break it up, but it must also be an experience. I mean, just
Yeah.
to sustain your attention or I
You know,
yeah,
so Philip
talk to
Glass,
me about that.
yeah, so Philip Glass also has some pieces that are really long, although they're not. So, for example, music in 12 parts,
Yeah.
which they come in little segments, so that's not so bad. But it's also a really long experience. And I was reading his autobiography, and he talked about some of the premieres of that music, where people would just, you know, get high and lay down and take a nap on the floor, and whenever they're performing in the space, some art gallery or whatever. I remember kids stay in drugs and don't do school, or the other way around, whatever. Yeah. So I guess that's one way of listening to it. But yeah, it's a real experience. I think the performance of this piece, the Feldman's Second String Quartet, it's almost like an installation. I think it goes on in art galleries. It's not typically a concert hall experience where you sit in a chair for 6 hours.
Right.
Although, in a way, that's kind of a Wagner opera. There's just a few moments where you can go get a couple of beverages and go to the bathroom in between. But you know, so that's like an afternoon at an evening at Bayreuth, but or at the Met. I mean, there's a lot of you know, experiences like that. But yeah, I think in what situation in our society today do we have where we are confronted with an experience that is not visually stimulating, so not a movie, not a Netflix marathon where we're completely just, you know, transfixed, we don't notice time, but something with just sound, really quiet music, where you're really confronted with stillness. And I think there's a lot of classical music, but especially Feldman's music that goes on for so long. It is a real experience, and that can really change you, and change your psyche. And I could wax poetically about healing, but you kind of get what I'm driving at. Now, as far as advice to a listener, I mean, I haven't even finished the piece necessarily.
Yeah.
I've checked it out of the library, and I read through parts of it with my quartet when I was in college. But
Yeah.
But I have
You're a cellist.
listened to,
right?
Yeah, I'm a cellist. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have listened to a good portion of it on a live stream. Back in the day, I don't know, back in like 2015 when the Flux Quartet was playing it. But I've also just listened to, you go on YouTube and you listen to just different parts of it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you don't have to listen to the whole piece. There's just so much great stuff there. You can just jump in and listen to a little bit of it, and that's typically the way that I listen to it.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, that's something I'm definitely going to check out because I'm not familiar with it.
Cool. His music is amazing. Alex Ross has a whole, he's the music critic from the New Yorker. He has a whole chapter, which I guess was an essay that he wrote, but a whole chapter in his book, The Rest is Noise, called American Sublime.
Uh-huh.
But it's all about Morton Feldman.
Yeah. Well, I want to keep going because, you know, time is going to run out soon.
There's so much great music. You know, I wanted to also, Dan, I also want to reach out to one other point.
Yeah.
Plug another podcast instead of ours. But there's a really great, you mentioned this whole uptown, downtown, midtown thing. And I think another way you could recategorize that potentially is academic versus non-academic.
Yes.
So, and there's a really great podcast produced by WQXR, hosted by Nadia Sirota, the violist. I think she used to be in Alarm Will Sound. Her father was Bob Sirota, a famous composer, and used to be the head of Peabody and a couple other music schools. Called Meet the Composer. It's really amazing classical, or not classical, but a really amazing series. I wish the production value I could afford and hire that many people to edit my podcast. But one of the my favorite episodes is called New Music Fight Club,
Mm-hmm.
where it tells the story of the two spheres of writing. So you have, starting with Schoenberg, who I don't know if necessarily intended for this to happen, but because of certain characters and composers like Schoenberg and Weber and techniques like serialism and 12-tone writing, as well as economic, frankly, you have a lot of for some reason music schools, music colleges, universities, conservatories became a big deal, and that was what employed a lot of composers, including you and me in parts of our careers. And working in a university has its own demands, right? So it's much more about what are you producing that's of not necessarily artistic value, because artistic value is really difficult to define and to grade, right? But more about intellectual. So much music of the last 150 years that has come from composers is very much about intellectual invention. And one of the theories that they propose in this podcast is that it's because it comes from the tenure process. Mm-hmm. Because people who are on your tenure committee may be a chemistry major, may be somebody who's like, you have to be able to prove, in a very theoretical way, the value of your piece. Yep. And it may be the audience is just other composers and theory people at a university, versus Philip Glass, right? Philip Glass probably wouldn't. I don't know if he would make tenure. I mean, he's never taught before. It's a completely different world. So I think that's a bit of a problem, frankly, as a person who's a fan of new music and who's an advocate for it. I host a podcast. It's largely talking about it. What's the state of our art? I think that is a problem in a way, and it's kind of an internal problem. But there's so much music that's being written right now that gets played once.
Yes,
and it's about music is about itself. It's about the process and not about the product and not about the effect on the listener.
So I have to persist on this topic a little longer, just because
it's relevant to you.
It's what I live in. So as the people who watch the blog probably know, although I get different audience from time to time, so you never know, but I am a composition professor in addition to being a composer. And I remember in my own career, actually, first, when I was growing up in the 90s, I know the new music even then. I played in the Cleveland Orchestra Youth Orchestra and went to Cleveland Orchestra concerts. It was really great being able to grow up in that environment. And some of the new music I heard at that time was like, wow, that's really different. And I thought, I love composing, but I don't know if I could write music like that. And that doesn't mean that I think it ultimately comes down to taste, of course, when it comes to aesthetics, do you love sweet wine? Do you love dry wine, or whatever? Can you appreciate it even if you don't love it? And so then going through college and going through graduate school, I had this constant tension of, well, am I going to do this composition thing? Well, I like to write music in this certain way. Is this going to work in a career? Can I make money at it? Blah, blah, blah. I even remember when I finally did pursue composition and I settled in on that, I still remember writing in different styles for different teachers.
Yeah.
And, and also writing in different ways for different circumstances, master classes, whatever. And then finally, after I got my professor position, the environment was actually changing. I mean, I was still writing to a certain extent with concern about, am I going to be accepted by the peer review committees that will give me tenure and promotion and all that? But by the same token, the people on the committees were also changing. You know, a lot of the older guard of the 60s and 70s, really, you know, hard-boiled serialist composers, that was not the same, that didn't carry the same force and weight as I was coming through as a professor as it did in the decades earlier. I think there's a lot more acceptance now of a wide variety of voices and sounds, and I think it's super healthy, and it's great for our field. I feel the freedom now to write whatever I want, as long, and I think it's important though that no matter what a composer is writing, that its internal logic, whatever that logic is, and you can argue about whether you like the logic or not, but the internal logic is what's critical. Does it make sense in what it sets out to do? And so yeah, the New Music Fight Club, that's a really interesting point where you went there, and you know, and there's great music from all different aesthetic sensibilities. Yeah. And now we're finally, I think, at a time where it can all be embraced and programmed in different venues for different reasons, etc. So I had to get that in there.
I find that the music of today that's being written today, I mean, really even starting in the 20th century, is exceptionally eclectic.
Yeah.
Which I love the music of the 20th century because it, and continuing today, because there are so many different isms. There's the Impressionism, Expressionism, Minimalism, you know, and even composers that are islands, you know, upon themselves. So there's really something for everybody. You know, one other name of a composer that I'm starting to get into that I have to mention is George Friedrich Haas.
Okay.
There's another great episode about largely about his music, on that podcast, Meet the Composer. Sort of talking about, he's pretty out about having like a dominant submissive relationship with his wife, and but it was also they kind of extrapolate that into having a sort of a composer having a dominant relationship with the submissive performers who have to practice this kind of but his music is incredibly luminous and beautiful and very creative and new, and you know, I always love it when I discover a new piece of music that somehow is different, something that I don't know already. You know, it's not in a certain style, that it really creates its own thing, and it feels like somebody discovered a new element.
Yeah. Well, is that your next listening pick, or?
Yeah, I don't have a specific piece in mind. If you just search any of his, you know, a lot of his music is meant to be played in the complete darkness.
Okay, yeah.
So that's another one of those examples of a piece of music that the experience of sitting in a room full of strangers in the dark, listening to this music, would be exceptionally memorable.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that's another thing I'm really excited to, you know, just explore on my own some more of that.
Yeah.
So I know our time is starting to wind down. Did you have any other picks you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great stuff, but I can name just a few others. Yeah. One piece of music that is a favorite of mine to perform, which I discovered in college, is by a composer named Kaija Saariaho, who's
okay, yes,
right now. She's had a couple of opera productions at the Met. She's from Finland. Yes. But this piece is for solo cello called Saint Papillon, Seven Butterflies.
Okay.
Which is just incredibly beautiful. I discovered it at a friend's cello recital, you know, student cello recital at McGill, and it's framed so beautifully by silence, and yet it has this really ephemeral. It's almost more tonal than tonal music itself, because it gets into the harmonics. So it's a lot of really weird techniques of playing like 3 harmonics at once on the cello, or 6 or 9, with different techniques of what do you call it? Trills, kind of like harmonic trills. So it was a real devil to learn on the cello. It's awkward, but it's incredibly beautiful, and you know, for people who like some sort of meditative piece, you know. you talk about butterflies, people think of them as really beautiful, which they are, but they're also bugs, and you get that sense of the real texture of the wings and what would it sound like to sit on one and crunch. And but it's incredibly beautifully framed. One of the something about her music, so much of her music I've listened to is incredibly well crafted. There's the form. Somehow you can really experience the form, and it takes your breath away. It's not just something like, oh, that was really smart. It's just very. She's a very poetic composer. This is very. The material she has is really interesting. A lot of harmonics. It's not a lot of really standard notes, even on the cello, but it just comes across in such a poetic, expressive way. And I guess my final pick that I mentioned today is the music of Dutilleux, Henri Dutilleux, who he sort of takes the mantle from Debussy and Ravel. He coexisted with Olivier Messiaen, as well as Pierre Boulez in that French era. Boulez is completely different, but but one of my favorite pieces is called Correspondance.
Okay.
And another one is called I think it's called Nuit Étoilée, Starry Night. It's talking about the Van Gogh painting, but it's another great example of music where you're talking about something beautiful like a butterfly or about the starry night, but you get to the real starry night, but there's black holes and supernova and stuff that's can destroy the world and destroy the earth, and so it's really beautiful music, and the harmony is really interesting.
Well, that's definitely something to check out. And one thing I think I was thinking about sort of as I was considering your listening list.
Yeah.
There seems to be overall a strong sense of the listener that would, when a listener's listening to it, you would need to sort of suspend sort of the traditional Germanic, or even whatever sense of harmonic progression, right? So a lot of these pieces have this sort of succession or evolution of sound mass to them. It seems like a pretty clear theme to me in all of the ones that you mentioned, and I'm just curious now, based on this, is that sort of a prejudice of your listening senses, or is it just a random assortment that you just happen to put together, or do you have a preference for music like that, etc.? I'm just
it's interesting. I don't typically listen to music in a way that most people do, in a way of just for fun, just listening. I'm constantly learning new music, and so I'm studying it. I might listen to the same passage over and over again with different recordings. I have nothing against, Beethoven or my bread and butter, man. But I've always, maybe because I was trying to be a composer, I've always been interested in discovering new stuff, discovering new sounds, discovering what's the state of the art. I think I must have some sort of interest in a lot of that atmospheric music, or not necessarily atmospheric, but harmonically driven, sustained, soft music in a lot of ways. A really great piece of music for 2020 is I think it's Gorecki's Third Symphony. I'm not even sure if I'm saying his name right. Symphony of Summer Songs. Yeah. I played that right after George Floyd was killed for my students. I typically would have a weekly discussion on Zoom, and so I said, this is a piece of music for pain, and but in some ways it's also very much about sound mass and repetition, but very, very tonal.
Yes. Yeah. So that piece is Gorecki's Third Symphony is very, very powerful, and very, very upsetting piece if you're in a difficult emotional state. But and that was something I talked about with some other people on my on the Muse and Music. And which is during quarantine time, does one want music that reflects your mood, or do you want music that takes you out of it, you know? And for some people listening to that symphony, it would just be emotionally overwhelming. Yet others actually gravitate to listening to music like that at this time. Like, you know, the game Pandemic was sold out of stores, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon now. So, I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, do you go for music that sort of reflects your state of mind, or do you go for music that is more of an escape?
Yeah, you know, when I am listening to music, you know, like I say, I don't listen to music in the traditional sense passively, right? I'm always actively listening, but yeah, I would say music that can speak to where I'm at and bring me someplace else. So if I'm feeling sad, I don't want to listen to If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands, right? It's just the dissonance of that. It's like, what are you talking about? You know, shut up. But like the Gorecki Third Symphony, there's something really powerful and poetic and transfixing. You know, a piece of music that I listen to always at the holidays for some reason is the Rachmaninoff All Night Vigil, the Vespers.
Uh-huh.
Which I don't know, maybe choral music at the holidays it feels, but it's not Christmas music strictly at all.
Yeah.
It's more of the Orthodox sort of Easter-ish tradition, but it's yeah. I think I look for music that can speak to where I'm at and help process that feeling. I think most people that I know that would be true for them. They look for music that can really articulate how they feel, but at the same time, through that process of articulation of, you know, in a way like reflecting how you feel, it can bring you to a new state.
Yeah, so that's, I think, a really, really interesting way of putting it, because you know, sometimes I hear people say, we talked about the polarity, but we didn't talk about what you just did, which was the transition from reflection then to transformation to elsewhere, which is really, it's a wonderful perspective on it. Certainly something, you know, as a composer myself, I think all the time about transformation in musical narrative.
Yeah.
For me, that's sort of the reason why I write, is transformation through musical narrative. So that's really, really amazing. And given all of this, I'm really excited to listen to your suggestions, and a bunch of other things came out as we talked, which was great. So there's probably like 12 pieces in here, even though you only named 6. But, you know, I really appreciate you talking with me. I think we had I had a great conversation, and really looking forward to listening to him.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and good luck with your podcast. This is cool. We're kind of both in the sort of the new music thing. Is this a podcast or a blog interview video thing?
Vlog, you know.
Vlog, yeah. I've got a few of those already. I mentioned you can search me on YouTube, Thomas Fortner, State of Our Art, and I'm just about to launch my podcast on all the podcast series.
No, that's great. And yeah, definitely check him out on, you know, look him up and
yeah, State of Our Art.
So thank you.